Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly livestock market update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner with This Is Always to Talk All Things Markets, University of Missouri, Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Cattle on feed. That's our big report this week, so it'll be a quick one for us. We're going to dig into those numbers a little bit. We'll probably talk a little drought also today. But to kick things off, let's recap what happened this week in the markets.
Yeah, Megan, this week on the cattle side, fed cattle prices were actually down $3.25 this week. On those feeder cattle markets, they were anywhere from 1 to 3 higher. Calves were a little lower, but feeder cattle tended to be that 1 to 3 higher. On the future side, October live cattle futures contract was down about $2.35, and the September feeder contract was down nearly $2.50. We did see higher choice box beef prices this week, up $8. That now puts those nearly $46 above where they were a year ago. So a nice move higher for choice box beef this week. On the hog side, cash barrels and gilts were down $5 this week. The October lean hog futures contract was up about 45 cents, and the pork cutout value was down about $4.15. And those belly prices certainly went lower this week.
Maybe someday it'll mean cheaper bacon at the grocery store, but I'm not holding my breath anytime soon.
A lot of volatility at the wholesale level and less volatility at the retail level.
All right, let's take a look at those weekly slaughter numbers. How are we looking and stacking up for both cattle and hogs?
Yeah, USDA tells us for the week ending August 19th, the run of 616,000 head of cattle. That's 13,000 head above where we were a week ago, but 48,000 head below where we were a year ago at this time. On the hog side, a run of 2.414 million head of hogs this week. That's 60,000 head above a week ago and 7,000 head above a year ago.
When we look at those year over year numbers, how are cattle and hog slaughter holding up?
Yeah, so cattle slaughter down 4.1% year to date, while hog slaughter is 1.3% higher.
It definitely seems like we're going in opposite directions, and really kind of an inverse of what we've been seeing in recent years.
That's right. So I think this is a good point to remind ourselves that, we've talked, you and I, about how hog prices, pork industries probably been less profitable this year, yet cattle prices have been at record levels at times. This idea that a 1.3% gain in production on hog slaughter, or I should say 1.3% gain on hog slaughter, is enough to talk about lower prices or lower hog prices. Yet when we see that on the cattle side, being down 4% gets us higher prices. If we were up 1.3% in terms of cattle slaughter, I think it would be a very different price situation.
All right, so let's get into this cattle on feed report as of August 1. Let's take a look at where we are on feed, and then I think we have to talk about placements.
That's right. So on feed August 1, USDA tells us 97.7% of a year ago. So lower cattle on feed inventory. None of that is terribly surprising given the data available to us. We're frankly, when we look at where we've been on terms of on feed numbers, 2023, the last 3 months have been smack dab on top of that 2017 to 21 average. So I like to make sure we stay a little bit in perspective of longer term. We're not that much lower. We certainly are lower than where we were in 2022 in terms of on feed numbers.
Placements, on the other hand, this month.
Yeah, so after a couple of months of higher placements, USDA told us for July placements were 91.7% of a year ago. Jumps out relative to pre-report estimates. The low end of pre-report was 90.4, so we didn't go outside the low end, but we certainly went about 3 percentage points below the midpoint of pre-report estimates. And so I think that reminds us that we're going to get tighter. I think when you look at Mexican cattle imports being up still pretty hard, Um, we might have expected a little larger placement number, yet I think what was happening here in the U.S. is we marketed a lot of cattle in the feed yards earlier this year when drought was tough, and now we're starting to see the lower numbers here. Cumulative placements for a second, not maybe the way we normally think about this. So we've placed in feed yards for the first 7 months of this year about 12.7 million head of feeder cattle. That's 2.3% below where we were last year in terms of those placements. Now, again, it tracks really close to and this time I've gotten 2015 through 2019 for you. We're actually 0.6% above for the first 7 months of this year relative to the 2015 to 2019 period. So kind of that pre-COVID period, as we just think about where we sit today.
We talk a little bit too about some of those other reports. You mentioned marketings. Marketings were down 5% compared to where we were a year ago. Are we surprised, even though we were still pulling? Is that largely due to the amount that we were pulling forward?
So I think that's certainly part of what's happening on the marketing side. All right. So, and we can't do that pull forward forever. So I think, again, marketings will continue to dwindle as we look ahead here, Megan. And I just remind us of USDA's got another big cut in beef production for 2024, which I am not arguing that they're wrong. It just tells me we're going to continue to talk about lower marketings through much of 2024.
I would assume this is all largely very supportive to prices in general, but how much does that hinge on demand?
Yeah, I think this continues to be the piece of the story that we have to really be paying attention to. We get ourselves in this bad habit of prices are going up. What do they have to do? Keep going up. And I think demand is the uncertain piece of this. And, take a little piece from the pork and chicken sectors in terms of what's been happening there. And again, I go, if it wasn't for the fact we were so tight on supplies, I think we'd have lower cattle prices. So there's risk here, risk that demand slows enough for the beef side that even though we're extremely tight on supplies, we don't keep moving higher. It's why I will say doing some risk management on the cattle price side may not be such a bad strategy. Someone recently was asking me, so you can now use LRP on your 2024 unborn calves. That's another opportunity to look further ahead and reduce some risk on calves you haven't even dropped yet. And so I think cattlemen need to, and again, I'll keep saying, please pay the premium, don't get an indemnity, of which seems to be fly in the face of logic, I'm sure, for folks. But I go, we don't get an indemnity, it means cattle prices stayed high. You pay the premium, providing a floor for yourself. But I'll keep saying there's more downside risk that still remains here if demand were to continue kind of the trend we've seen of the last few months here of 2023.
I want to talk random notes in my cattle on feed report. When I look at it, something that jumps out to me, we don't always talk about this: disappearances, 16% compared higher than it was in 2022. What can those disappearances mean, or where do we find those or not find them because they're not there?
Yeah. So I think in some cases you might have a situation where cattle that went on feed, they might have moved back out of that feed yard. That's one way we can talk about other disappearance, changing, death loss, etc. So perhaps we see a little bit of hotter weather affecting that other disappearance from what we had happen in July in some parts of the country. I remember a week or two here, or or maybe more, especially in the southern part of the US where we were talking about some pretty high heat levels. So perhaps that also had something to do. Now, I will say, so 65,000 head was other disappearance for this July. 56,000 was last July of 2022. The 56,000 may have been low relative to normal as well. So part of the 16% increase that you see in the report might have a little bit to do with 2022. And I put that in perspective because in June we had 69,000 head of other disappearance, both June of 22 and June of 23. So the 56 in July of 22 may be the outlier here.
I want to, before I let you go, it's really kind of all of the high notes from that cattle on feed report. I think we have to talk a little bit drought as we think about in terms of, we talk about high prices, maybe decent weather helps spur some expansion for some producers who are in that position. Definitely some improvement in some areas and some intensification in drought, depending on where you're looking. How does that kind of play into this big picture as we look ahead to the rest of 2023 and thinking about those unborn calves in 2024?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to this question, and it's the relevant discussion for us to be having. So I hear anecdotally, places like Wyoming, where it was really dry for a period of time, has had some nice recovery and some of the best grass they've seen in a long time. Does that incent some increase in beef cow inventory there? I'll take Missouri. We're in a much different place than we were 60 days ago. That isn't that we aren't still dry in places. How does the balance of weather versus profitability affect expansion plans? I guess I'm still in the camp of I don't see a quick turnaround. I think you still have a number of producers who are looking at, do I want to send that heifer to the feed yard at these prices or retain her for potentially future income stream? I think a lot of them are saying she's worth too much. I'm going to go put her in the feed yard. And so I think building back some hay inventory is going to be a requirement before we get too many folks expanding too quickly. And maybe we can try to make a little dent in that before we get to the end of the year with some better fall growth than we might have expected, at least in some parts of the country 30, 60 days ago. But got to get some hay inventory built back before I think we get too excited about expansion. The data that we all have been looking at, you and I have been looking at the percentage of heifers on feed. We didn't get that data this month, but last month when it came, that did not suggest we were holding back heifers. Although beef cow slaughter has been running below year-ago levels were extremely high. The levels we're running at, to me, don't suggest we're going to get expansion. So I keep kind of saying a slower recovery now. What could change? Cattle prices could keep going higher and at some point get us back to record profitability like we would have seen in 2014. But that might be the factor that would speed up some growth in cow inventory.
It's that two-part also, Scott. So not just talking about those record high prices or even higher prices, but also maybe a pullback in input costs, thinking about feed availability if we have a better crop than expected. Now I say that, and there's another heat wave coming in through a critical time for soybeans and for crops too this coming week. But I mean, do we maybe see a different shift after we see what happens with this harvest?
Yeah, absolutely, Megan. I think that opportunity sits there, and you're right. We don't have the crop in the bin. What happens between now and when we harvest, at least in some parts of the country? I know we're started at harvest in some areas, but got a lot of crop left to harvest. To me, if we put a bigger crop in the bin, we could pull down feed costs. Hay prices could come down, and that's going to be important to the profitability picture. I always will remind us that in 2014, we had corn prices back below $4 a bushel before we saw a lot of expansion going on. And although in some parts we're getting closer to that, we're not there yet. So I think that there's a good chance that if weather holds with us here, that we'll start to help on the feed cost side, and that again could encourage. I've had conversations with producers who are saying, it's been a good year. Those are the ones that have had, I think, ample hay supplies in their area that haven't had to go buy hay, that say that. Now, I think the other piece of this puzzle still lies with interest rates. I think interest rates are going to stay high and potentially go higher. And the amount of money one has in a per cow basis is amazing just a few years ago, Megan. And so the operating interest one may have to pay on that per cow basis may be what kind of keeps us from expanding too quickly as well.
Borrowing is not cheap right now.
It is not. I don't care what you're borrowing for. It has gotten a lot more expensive, and I'm not sure we're done. This can go back to our whole discussion about what's the Fed going to do. Is it going to continue to raise rates until we get inflation 2% or below? And I think if the answer to that question is yes, you don't have much choice, but at some point to keep trying to push up on rates.
Scott, that'll do it for us this week. Looking ahead, we have cold storage and livestock slaughter. I'm betting I know what you're going to watch next week in that livestock slaughter report.
Yeah, so beef cow slaughter is going to be interesting out of next week's report. So we're going to have to really watch what's the first thing that triggers that says, hey, we're holding back cows, and maybe we get some data there that makes us change our mind about how fast we can build. But that to me, that's the big piece that we're going to keep watching as we look ahead.
Scott, always great to see you. We will talk to you next Friday.
Sounds great, Megan.
Our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning. Go to brownfieldagnews.com. You can also ask questions and comments if you have them as well. And for a daily rundown of what happened in the markets, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.